People assume an avoidant ends up with someone easy, someone who never questions, never pushes, never asks for more than the bare minimum. But that's the lie everyone believes. The surface level story people repeat without ever understanding what truly shifts an avoidant's guarded heart. The truth is quieter, sharper, almost ironic. Avoidants never choose the person who chases. They choose the one who stops running because the chase feels like pressure, like scrutiny, like a spotlight forcing them to perform emotional closeness they were never taught to feel safe in. When someone chases them, an avoidant retreats deeper into themselves, convinced they're about to be swallowed whole. They pull back, withdraw, detach, not because the chaser isn't worthy, but because being wanted that intensely triggers everything they've spent their whole life trying to outrun. It reminds them of suffocation, of expectations, of the fear that they'll fail someone again. But the person who stops running, that's different. That person doesn't suffocate. They mirror the avoidant's emotional pace. They don't beg, they don't cling, they don't demand answers every time the avoidant goes silent. Instead, they create space not as a punishment, but as a natural boundary. And that space feels like oxygen to someone who lives guarded. Suddenly, the avoidant isn't dodging emotional demands. They're noticing the absence of them. They're noticing the quiet. They're noticing the person who is no longer waiting in the doorway with open arms. And for the first time, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar loss, not the dramatic, explosive kind, but the subtle ache of realizing the person they thought would always be available has stopped reaching. That moment sparks something the chaser could never ignite: curiosity, then awareness, then longing. The avoidant begins replaying old conversations, noticing the softness in that person's presence, remembering how it felt to be understood without being cornered. The emotional distance that once felt protective now feels empty. This is the twist no one expects. Avoidants fall for the one who respects their independence, but doesn't shrink themselves to earn love. The one who doesn't try to rescue them from their emotional walls. The one who simply steps back and chooses themselves. And that's when the avoidant realizes something they were never ready for. That real love isn't found in the person who chases them relentlessly, but in the person who offers closeness without losing themselves. The avoidant ends up with the one who stops running, because that's the only person who teaches them the truth they've been avoiding all their life. Love can feel safe. Connection doesn't have to be a threat. And sometimes losing the one who walked away becomes the moment an avoidant finally wakes up to everything they were afraid to want. Avoidants are drawn to the one who doesn't beg, not because they crave emotional coldness, but because they are terrified of the weight of someone else's need. The avoidant heart has always lived with an unspoken rule: pressure equals danger, closeness equals exposure. So when someone responds to their distance with panic, fear, and frantic reaching, it sets off every alarm they've spent their entire life trying to silence. But the person who stands steady in the silence, not cold, not detached, just grounded, becomes the quiet contradiction the avoidant never sees coming. This is the person who can hold space without demanding more than the avoidant can give in the moment. And that calmness, that emotional stability, becomes magnetic. Because here's the truth: avoidants never admit out loud they watch everything. They notice who reacts to their withdrawal with desperation, and they notice who notices the distance but doesn't lose themselves in it. The avoidant has been conditioned to believe that love suffocates, that closeness devours personal freedom, that connection means eventually being consumed by expectations. So when someone refuses to chase, refuses to plead, refuses to fall apart, they experience something new, something unfamiliar: safety, real, emotional, undemanding safety, the kind that doesn't ask them to perform or change or suddenly become someone who knows how to navigate intimacy flawlessly. The person who doesn't beg sends a silent message the avoidant hears loud and clear: you can come closer, then I won't crumble. And that is the antidote to their fear. Because the avoidant withdraws partly to test, partly to protect, and partly to escape what they think will become emotional chaos. But when they pull back and the other person simply breathes, stays centered, respects the space, and remains themselves, the avoidance worldview starts to crack. It forces them to reconsider the narrative they've been loyal to: that people are inherently overwhelming, that closeness always leads to pressure, that they need distance to stay safe. Ironically, the avoidant will often walk away from the person who chases them. but they will quietly drift back toward the one who doesn't. Not because they want to be with someone indifferent, but because they finally found someone who can handle their pace, their rhythm, their moments of retreat. Someone who doesn't interpret distance as rejection. Someone who doesn't turn silence into a collapse. Someone who can remain whole in the gaps. And that's the kind of person the avoidant ends up trusting. The one who creates emotional space without punishment. The one who doesn't melt down when communication slows. The one who shows the avoidant through calmness instead of chaos. That connection doesn't have to be a battlefield, doesn't have to be a chase. It doesn't have to be a cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. The person who doesn't beg is the one who shows the avoidant something they've never truly felt. Love that doesn't demand and a presence that doesn't disappear. The truth is, avoidants don't end up with the loudest person in the room. They don't stay with the one who tries to pull them close every time they step back. They don't feel safe with someone who interprets every silence as rejection or every pause as proof. They're unloved. Avoidants choose the one who becomes a calm mirror, the rare person who doesn't absorb their distance like a personal wound, who doesn't translate space into abandonment. This kind of person is steady in a way most people aren't. They don't crumble when the avoidant pulls away. They don't beg for reassurance. They don't try to pry open a heart that isn't ready. Instead, they hold their own emotional center, grounded and unshaken, offering presence without pressure. And that stability hits the avoidant in a place they're not used to because it's not a challenge, not a chase, not an emotional tug of war. It's a calm acceptance. This calm mirror is the person who reminds the avoidant of something they've never truly had, safety without suffocation. This is the person who says, "Take your space, I won't fall apart," and actually means it. No emotional punishments, no passive aggressive reaction, no spirals of panic, just quiet confidence. And for avoidance, that's disarming. Because they're used to people collapsing under their withdrawal, they're used to guilt trips, accusations, emotional meltdowns, which only confirm their belief that closeness is dangerous and space is necessary. But when the calm mirror stands firm, the avoidant feels something rare: respect for their boundaries, not fear, not pressure, not neediness, respect. And that's what pulls them back. This person isn't emotionally cold, they're emotionally regulated. They don't interpret distance as a threat because they trust their own worth. They're not chasing, not pleading, not trying to fix anything. They simply exist as a solid presence, and avoidants gravitate toward that, like gravity. They didn't see coming. The avoidant finds themselves returning, not because they were chased, but because they weren't. They return because the calm mirror shows them something they've never been given. A relationship where space doesn't equal danger and closeness doesn't equal loss of identity. The calm mirror doesn't try to control the avoidance rhythm. They flow with it. They understand that withdrawal isn't rejection, it's regulation. They understand that silence isn't punishment, it's protection. They understand that the avoidance emotional pacing isn't about disconnection, it's about survival. And this understanding builds a different kind of bond, one that isn't forged in intensity, but in trust. Slow, steady. For avoidance, this kind of person feels like a refuge. They don't take things personally. They don't make everything about themselves. They don't demand emotional access before the avoidant is ready. They simply hold their own center. And that steadiness becomes the safest place the avoidant has ever experienced. Because for the first time, the avoidant realizes they don't have to run. They don't have to hide. They don't have to fight to protect their space. With a calm mirror, space is honored, connection is slow, and intimacy isn't a threat, it's a choice. And that is the person they end up choosing. Avoidants are terrified of pressure, not because they don't care, but because closeness feels like a trap disguised as affection. They've spent their whole lives learning that the moment someone gets too close, expectations follow, and demands feel like suffocation. So when someone pushes for more connection, when someone needs constant reassurance, when someone tries to pull them into emotional intensity, the avoidant instinctively recoils. Not out of cruelty, but out of survival. This is why the person who insists, who chases, who clings, who tries to close the gap becomes the very thing the avoidant escapes. It's not the behavior itself, it's the emotional weight behind it. The invisible pressure, the need to respond immediately, the unspoken requirement to match intensity. But then there's the other type of person, the one who stands still, the one whose presence isn't loud, demanding, or draining, but solid, calm, steady, self contained. This person doesn't chase, but they don't disappear either. They hold space without gripping it. And that stillness, it speaks to the avoidant in a language they actually understand. Because avoidants respect emotional neutrality the way someone lost at sea respects a lighthouse. Not too close, not too far, but always there. They can breathe around this person. They don't feel watched, measured, or evaluated. They don't feel like every moment of silence is a crisis or a test. This person doesn't crumble when the avoidant steps back. They don't panic when communication slows down. They don't interpret distance as rejection. They simply stay grounded, rooted in their own emotional world. And that stability becomes magnetic in a way the avoidant can't fully explain. They're drawn to it, not with excitement, but with relief. A rare feeling for someone who's always on guard. This is the partner who doesn't try to fix them, heal them, or force intimacy on them. They don't point out inconsistencies. They don't pressure them to open up. They don't weaponize feelings. They exist with a quiet confidence that says, I'm here, but I don't need to hold you hostage. And that, ironically, is what brings the avoidant closer. Not because they're being pursued, but because they aren't. Not because they're being needed, but because they're being respected. Avoidants don't move toward intensity. They move toward emotional safety. They move toward someone who can sit in silence without spiraling, someone who can give space without resentment, someone who doesn't try to fill every gap with noise or anxiety. The unshakable presence becomes the only place where the avoidant doesn't feel like they need to defend themselves. It becomes the first relationship where space isn't a threat and connection isn't a burden. In that rare balance, distance without punishment, closeness without pressure, the avoidant finally stops running. Because for the first time, they don't have to. Avoidants don't open up easily, not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much. They walk through relationships with a quiet, hidden panic, a fear that if someone sees the real them, the soft parts beneath the distance, it'll be used against them. So they build defenses, layers of emotional steel, rehearsed attachment, practiced quiet. Most people only ever meet the armor. Most people think the armor is the person, and that's why most people never get past it. But every avoidant has one person, the one they end up choosing, who does something no one else thinks to do. They don't try to break down the walls. They try to understand why the walls exist. This person isn't loud. They're not dramatic. They don't demand vulnerability like it's owed. They don't interrogate emotional distance or try to pull confessions out of the avoidant like teeth. They simply see what others miss, that the avoidant silence isn't cruelty, it's protection. That the withdrawal isn't rejection, it's fear. They recognize the difference between someone who doesn't care and someone who cares so deeply. They're afraid of the consequences of being known. And because they can see the human behind the habit, they respond differently. They don't chase, they don't beg, they don't push, but they don't disappear either. They stay, not in a suffocating way, but in an anchored, grounded way. They show the avoidant something rare: consistency without pressure, presence without demand, curiosity without intrusion. They create a space where the avoidant learns slowly, quietly, that they won't be punished for opening up, that their feelings won't be used as leverage, that their fears won't be thrown back at them during conflict. This is the person who becomes safe enough for the avoidant to finally whisper things they never planned to say out loud, the person who hears the tremble under the avoidant's steady tone and doesn't expose it. The person who realizes the way the avoidant turns away is actually them trying not to break. The person who can look at the armor and say, I know you're protecting something precious. I won't touch it until you hand it to me. This kind of understanding is magnetic to an avoidant, not because it forces them open, but because it gives them space to open themselves. And when an avoidant chooses someone like this, it's not quick, it's not sudden, it's not dramatic. It happens the way ice melts, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day the armor softens and the truth comes out. They never needed someone to break their walls. They needed someone who could see the person inside them and not run. Because avoidants don't open up for the one who pushes hardest. They open up for the one who understands them before they're ready to speak. Avoidants aren't searching for flawless people or perfect love stories. That's the biggest misunderstanding. They don't want a partner who checks every box, heals every wound, or knows exactly what to say at every moment. Perfection overwhelms them, idealization scares them. Being placed on a pedestal feels like a threat, not a gift. What they're actually looking for is something far quieter, something softer, something safer. Because for an avoidant, connection doesn't happen fast. It doesn't ignite instantly. It doesn't begin with fireworks or grand confessions. For them, connection starts slowly, like a dim flame that only grows when it's not suffocated by pressure. That's why they end up with someone who understands this rhythm, someone who doesn't panic when things move at a different pace, someone who doesn't mistake slow for disinterested. This kind of unexpected compatibility shows up in the person who understands that love doesn't have to be loud to be real. The person who intuitively senses that the avoidance silence isn't rejection, it's self-protection. The person who knows how to stay steady even when the avoidant pulls back because they recognize that withdrawal isn't always about them. Sometimes it's about fear, sometimes it's about overwhelm, sometimes it's simply the avoidant trying to catch their breath in a world that demands too much too fast. Avoidants gravitate toward the one who sees this without taking it personally, the one who can read the quiet, the one who can handle a slower unfolding without needing constant reassurance. They want someone who can sit in the pauses and not feel abandoned, someone who doesn't mistake space for danger, someone who doesn't crumble when the connection goes still for a moment because they trust that stillness doesn't mean endings. And it's in that trust, that emotional steadiness, that the avoidant finally relaxes. Because emotional safety for them is not about intensity, it's about consistency. Not about closeness on command, but closeness that grows naturally. They don't want the person who tries to rush into their guarded heart. They want the person who understands that the heart opens on its own time. The unexpected compatibility is this: they fall for the one who lets the connection breathe. The one who doesn't demand certainty before it's ready. The one who doesn't chase validation. The one who doesn't drown the avoidant in emotional urgency. Instead, they offer patience without passivity, warmth without pressure, presence without neediness. This is what feels safe. This is what feels real. This is what an avoidant slowly learns to trust, not perfection, but balance. Because deep down, avoidants aren't incapable of love. They're incapable of love that feels threatening, rushed, or overwhelming. But give them someone who moves gently, someone who matches their pace, someone who understands that slow connection is still connection and everything changes. That's the person they end up choosing, not the perfect one, the safe one. The moment an avoidant chooses someone is never loud, never obvious, never wrapped in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It doesn't come with a speech, a promise, or a sudden emotional breakthrough. In fact, most people completely miss it because avoidants don't choose with words. They choose with quiet shifts, soft changes, and subtle openings that only the right person can recognize. For an avoidant, choosing someone is terrifying. It means risking the very abandonment they've spent their entire life trying to outrun. It means letting someone get close enough to see the cracks, the insecurities, the fears they usually hide behind sarcasm, distance, or distraction. And yet, when it happens, it's unmistakable. Not loud, but unmistakable. It starts small, almost microscopic. They begin showing up a little more consistently. They reply faster than usual, not instantly, but noticeably. Their messages become less functional and more intentional. They initiate conversations not out of duty, but because they're thinking about you. Widen, they start remembering little details you mention, what stresses you out, what makes you laugh, what you dream of doing someday. Avoidants don't store information about people. They plan on avoiding, they only remember what matters. Then something even more surprising happens. They create space, not distance, space. Space for you in their routines, space in their day, space in their mind. They check in even when they don't have to. They make plans first instead of waiting for you to ask. They carve out time in ways they've never done before. Avoidants protect their personal space like it's sacred territory. So when they start sharing it, make no mistake, that's choosing. But the biggest shift happens internally. They stop running, not because they've suddenly become secure and not because their fear has magically disappeared. They stop running because you never pushed them to chase you. You never demanded closeness. You never tried to force connection, while everyone else grabbed at them, tried to fix them, or begged for reassurance. You did something different. You stayed steady. You didn't punish their distance. You didn't collapse when they pulled away. You didn't make their fear your responsibility. That kind of emotional stability isn't just comforting to an avoidant, it's magnetic. It becomes the anchor they didn't know they needed. And so the avoidant begins to lean carefully at first, hesitantly, quietly. You'll see it in their tone, in the softness of their responses, in the way they start letting you into the hidden parts of their world. They won't call it vulnerability, but that's exactly what it is. It won't look dramatic, but it will feel different. Avoidants don't choose with declarations. They choose with presence. They choose with consistency. They choose with the tiny acts of openness they've never offered anyone else. And when they choose you, you'll feel it, not in their words, but in the silence that finally becomes safe. Avoidants have a rhythm that most people misunderstand, a rhythm shaped by fear, independence, and the quiet terror of being known too deeply. And this is where the paradox begins. Because while the world assumes avoidants want reassurance, validation, and constant proof of loyalty, the truth is the opposite. They don't run from love. They run from pressure. They run from the weight of someone needing them more than they can emotionally breathe. They run from being the center of someone's stability. And every time they sense that someone's balance collapses without them, they retreat even further into emotional distance. But here's the contradiction no one expects. Avoidants gravitate toward the person who doesn't crumble in their absence. The person who doesn't beg, plead, or panic when silence fills the space. The one who can survive without daily reassurance, intense contact, or constant emotional feeding. Avoidants are pulled toward someone who chooses them, but doesn't need them. That difference is everything, because needing feels suffocating. Choosing feels safe. They quietly observe how people react when they take space, and they notice two types of reactions. One reacts with fear, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being ignored, the fear that silence equals rejection. That person unintentionally ends up confirming the avoidant's biggest fear. If I get close, I'll be responsible for someone's emotional world, and that pressure makes them distance even further. Not because they don't care, but because they literally don't know how to carry someone else's emotional survival. The other reaction, calm, stability, a sense of self that doesn't disappear just because the avoidants step back. They don't lash out, they don't chase, they don't spiral. They simply continue being themselves, leaving the door open without trying to drag the avoidant through it. This person becomes magnetic, not because they play games, but because they are grounded enough not to be shaken by distance. And here's the paradox. Avoidants run from the person who needs constant reassurance, yet they deeply want to be chosen by someone who doesn't depend on them for emotional error. Avoidants aren't drawn to distance, they're drawn to strength, not loud strength, not controlling strength, but the quiet, unshakable kind. The kind that says, I want you here, but I don't collapse when you're gone. The avoidance fear has always been the same. If they open up, they'll be swallowed whole by someone else's emotional needs. But when they meet someone who doesn't chase, doesn't cling, doesn't guilt trip, and doesn't fall apart at the slightest disconnect, something shifts. They feel safe, they feel respected, they feel understood. And for avoidance, understanding is the deepest intimacy they know. The paradox is simple but powerful. Avoidants don't choose the person who needs them most. They choose the person who is whole on their own, yet still chooses to stay. There comes a moment in every avoidance story that no one talks about. A moment so subtle, so quiet, that even the avoidant doesn't fully understand what's happening until it's already reshaping the way they breathe. It doesn't happen in a dramatic fight or in a tearful confession or in some cinematic breakthrough where they suddenly know how to love. Avoidants don't operate in grand gestures. They operate in internal shifts. And the biggest shift of all is when they realize they're not suffocated. It begins with a feeling they're not used to, ease, the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation. The absence of someone constantly reaching out, asking for reassurance, asking for closeness, asking for more. All their life, closeness has felt like a trap, a tightening pressure around their chest, a slow closing of the walls. People get near, and the avoidant feels the instinctive urge to retreat, to protect themselves, to make sure no one gets close enough to hurt them. They don't run because they don't care. They run because they care too much, and caring has always been dangerous. But then they meet someone different, someone steady, someone calm, someone who doesn't make love feel like a test. They are destined to fail. And one day, quietly, without any dramatic moment, something shifts inside them. It hits them in a way they can't explain. This is the first person I don't feel trapped with. This realization isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or adrenaline. It comes like a soft click, something sliding into place after years of misalignment. They notice they don't need to withdraw as far to feel safe. They notice they don't dread a message from this person. They notice they don't feel that familiar urge to sabotage the connection. Instead, they feel a strange, unfamiliar desire to stay, not because they're suddenly healed, not because they've overcome their fears, not because love suddenly became easy, but because this person never tried to cage them. This person didn't demand closeness, they allowed it. They didn't chase, they showed up. They didn't panic at distance, they understood it. They didn't crumble when the avoidant pulled away. They held their center. And slowly, the avoidant realizes something profound. Safety isn't found in the person who wants more from them. Safety is found in the person who doesn't ask them to be more than they are. This is the paradox of avoidant love. They stay when they don't have to run. They open up when there's no pressure to prove themselves. They soften when the other person remains grounded. They become consistent when the other person remains unshaken. And so the avoidant begins to choose, not with words, but with behavior. They answer faster. They initiate more. They start sharing details they used to keep locked away. They make space where before they only built walls. Not because they've changed who they are, but because someone finally gave them the space to come closer on their own terms. And that's when the avoidance stays, not out of fear, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of genuine, quiet trust. Avoidants don't end up with the person who chases the hardest. They end up with the person who gives them room to come closer and waits without fear while they decide to stay.